Welcome back to the next video on point pattern analysis, where we will continue the discussion of sampling techniques used in performing point pattern analysis. The last time we hinted at the importance of new pattern analysis techniques, which you can see again here. And the main advantage of these is that they take into consideration pattern across a range of scales. For example, last time we mentioned that if we take a look at one of these, like the L analysis, and we have a pattern that we measure that does something like this, if it doesn't follow along with the CSR, that we have regions where we have clustering and we have an even distribution here. And it might be really interesting to be able to differentiate between these different scales in our analysis. And so the techniques we'll talk about today will be looking at things from this perspective. Just to give you an example of the kind of pattern we might see that would be interesting in this regard would be that we could have a plant species that's a new invader into an area. The initial colonists may occur in random locations, and if we sample early on, we'd find a random pattern at this broad scale. However, once the invaders start producing offspring, the new plants may occur close to the initial parent plant that's there, and we might see a clustered pattern at the scale of local dispersal. If we dig a little deeper, however, within that local cluster, there may be strong competition among the individual plants that have been dispersed and established, and that could actually cause hyperdispersion or an even distribution within that smaller scale. So in this case, we could see three different parts of the pattern. We could have a random pattern at one scale. We could have at another scale a clustered pattern, and at a third scale there could be a more even distribution. So we can take a look quickly at how this might appear. And so in the example I just stated, we could have individuals that come in and establish kind of at random as parent plants. Then we have seeds that are produced that produce new individuals around those initial parents. And as I'm trying to draw it here, they tend to be rather evenly distributed because of competitive interactions. And so we would have a very different pattern. So if we take a look at the really broad scale like here and look at it, it would look to some extent like a random pattern if we only consider the adult plants. If we take a look at the local clusters, or if we take a look and more individuals, including the new recruits, we would see clustering at one scale. And if we go down and dig at an even smaller scale, we may see an even distribution. The techniques we talked about before would not be able to characterize this pattern other than simply saying it's random or not, and if it's not random, it's clustered or hyperdispersed. It wouldn't be able to differentiate any of the nuances that we see in these more complex things that occur ecologically. So, in order to take advantage of these newer techniques, we require what is referred to often as complete sampling. So this is a much bigger requirement in terms of what we need for data to accomplish the task of talking about what kind of pattern we actually have. So if we have a pattern like this, this may be a population of plants or gopher mounds in a very broad area. We often don't want to study the entire universe of where these points are because that would be way too much work, and sometimes we want to be a little lazier than having to do that. So what we usually do is start by defining a measurement domain, which is the area that we're actually going to sample. And so I've shown this here by the area that we're going to consider, and so we basically don't take into consideration all the points around it. One of the main goals here, though, however, is that we need to be careful in how we characterize what the sampling domain is to be sure that the area where we're doing our study is representative of the population at large. So again, we look at the sampling domain, and within that, we need to sample all of the individual points that occur in it. So we need to be exhaustive in our search for where these different points are, because we need to have complete information within the sample domain to do these more sophisticated analyses. And so once we've done this, the thing that we need to do once we've found the points is that we want to define them in a way that can be used in an analysis. And so we usually come up with a mathematical description so that this can be done, used in an analytical technique to determine what kind of spatial pattern we have. And at the very least, what we want to do is to characterize position. And so in all of these techniques, we try to apply X and Y coordinates to each individual point in our sample domain. And so the techniques that I'll discuss today are going to center on how we go about doing this. Another thing that we may also be interested in is some component of how the individuals differ. So we may be interested in things such as differences in diameter if it's a tree or a clump-growing plant. We may be interested in total biomass of the individuals or stage of development so that we can compare how individuals of different size or at different stages of development are patterned with respect to one another. When we add this kind of third characteristic to the system, this is often referred to as a marked point pattern analysis, or a marked point pattern. And so this can be another layer of complication. Today I'm not going to be talking about those techniques. What I'm going to be doing is looking at how we can assign spatial location, that is X and Y coordinates, to our objects within our sample domain. So how do we go about collecting these data? Well, there's been a progression over time in the approaches that have been done, but in general, there are three different basic steps that are involved. We've discussed the first one, which is to find a system we're interested in, define the sample domain, and determine what kinds of objects we're interested in. In this case, these are mounds here, and so these would be the points that we would sample. So we would find all of them within our sampling domain. So that defines where our study area is. Next, we need to apply some form of assessment of what the spatial location is so that we can apply as accurately as possible X and Y coordinates to the objects within our domain. And so this shows one of the earlier ways of doing this in a complete way using a surveyor transit. This is a pole with a transit looking at the pole and assessing its location relative to some other points. These techniques have been around for a really long period of time and have been used by ecologists in the context of point pattern analysis. The third component is once we get the X and Y coordinates, we put these into a computer, and this gives us a computerized map, in essence, of where the locations of our objects are within the context of our sample domain, which is shown here. And so this is a graphical representation of the data that would be in the computer that we can use to analyze using these more modern point pattern analysis techniques. So let's start with some of the earliest approaches to how to do this. This, again, is something that has been developed in the process of surveying land. In North America, there's a huge history of this, particularly in my part of the country, where they sent out surveyors who surveyed the entire state of Iowa over a several-year period using transits like this theodolite here. The main thing that these instruments do is you put them over for a known point, and you can have a second point, and you use this, you rotate it around and sight through it to a pole, and it gives you an angle from a known angle, and you can use this in triangulating when you measure the distance between points as well. This shows, again, doing this in the field. The transit would be here in the background, somebody with a transit, and then we have the pole that's sighted here. On the pole itself are often measures of height above ground in meters, and so by knowing that the transit is level, you can also tell differences in topography. So you can map the X, Y locations of the points and get information about topography as well, which can be really interesting. So how do we go about using this information? Well, it's basic trigonometry, if you remember that from school. And so what we do is we find a base point where we start out, so we could call this point A. And what we do is we put the transit over this point and we level it and determine the height above ground that the eyepiece is so that we can do height measurements. And then we can measure angles in the 360-degree circle around that point. Once we've got that established, we set up a second point, and we can call this point B, and we use the transit to measure the angle from a known angle. So we could have this as, if we have this as north, and we've set up our transit so that north is at 0, we can measure the angle in that direction to determine what direction B is from the initial point. And then once we've established that angle, we can measure the distance, and that forms the baseline for finding out what the coordinates are from every other point. If we set up this axis as our x-axis, A, for example, would be given a coordinate in a XY coordinate system of 0, 0, and B would be given a coordinate of 0, D. Next, what we do is we place our transit at point B, and we start finding other points that we're interested in finding out their XY coordinates. So with the transit set at B, we can use it to sight back at A. We know the distance to A, and then we do the sighting to our point C here and determine what that angle is there. And we'll call it that. And so we also figure out the distance between B and C here. And by knowing the angle and between those A and B, we know two distances. We know the distance D between A and B, and we know this other distance D between B and C. Using basic trigonometry, we now, let me change the color there, we now know what the X and Y coordinates for point C are. We can continue doing this for any number of points where they're within range of this baseline A and B. If we get too far out of this picture and can no longer do that easily, what we can do is we can set up at C, we know its coordinates, and we can do the same triangulation from there between different base points and continue on. So this is a common way of surveying in these kinds of points. It's labor intensive, but it can be quite accurate. We can also use another approach, which is what we've done in some of our studies, where we use a surveyed grid approach. Instead of doing the triangulation to every point in the system, what we do is we set up a grid where we set our initial point at 0, 0 here, so that's 0, 0. We set up our second point here, so that would be A there, and this would be B here. We measure the distance, which in this case is 80 meters. And then what we can do is we can set up corners, and in this case we've done it every 10 meters into a gridded system where we know precisely what that position is in the coordinate system, what that position is, etc. for the entire grid. Then when we have a mound that we want to measure, we don't have to use the survey equipment. What we can do is we know we're at this point here, and we can measure the relative displacement in the x direction and in the y direction for this point, and give it its coordinates without having to use the survey equipment. And this can be quite accurate as well. So this is an approach that's often used because you spend a lot of time setting out this grid very accurately. You put in corner posts with notation on it so you know which corner you're at, and then you can measure points within that grid without having to use this more complicated measuring technique using the transit. Another thing that's come about that makes this a lot easier to do is that the technology for doing surveying has improved really greatly. We have a picture of what's called a total station here. They're now are digitized instead of having analog dials that you have to read. You turn once you've trued the transit to a certain direction, you can turn it around and there's a readout on the screen that tells you what the angle is. You can punch a button and it will keep that in the data so that you store the data there. You can add other information that you might want, such as distances. Although now some of these transits have lasers or infrared in them, so that you have a transit pole that has a mirror on it, and you can shoot the light to the mirror and it bounces back and it gives you a very accurate measurement of distance. So you no longer have to use meter tapes. All you have to do is set up your A and B positions, and then I put the pole on different points. You get the transit set on that so that you have it pointed to the mirror. The mirror is set at the height at which horizontal beam will hit it. You hit a button, it tells you the distance and the angle. It's stored inside the computer and the transit. You do this for a large number of points. Then you can go back down to the lab and download the data, and you have your XY coordinates without having to transcribe them. And it's much more accurate, and there's much less likelihood of mistakes. And so this is an advanced approach using theodolites. So theodolites and their descendants have been around for a very long period of time. They've been used extensively in ecology, but there's been another revolution in location measuring that has been provided by the advent of GPS. As you all know, I have one sitting here in my pocket. There's a GPS in most smartphones, if not all now, and this can be used to determine GPS coordinates. It's nice if you're trying to get around a city like Göttingen, but it's not so good if you're trying to do accurate scientific measurements in the field. So to do that, there are a large number of very technical GPSs that are out there that are very accurate. They're often referred to as sub-meter GPSs, where you can get accurate meter measurements within a centimeter if you have a really good signal and a really good device. Now, there's been a really interesting history in the use of GPS. It's not always been as good as it is today. As you may know, GPSs were first put in place by the military in the United States and in Russia. I don't know which was first, but they had satellites that were in geosynchronous orbit that would be used for locating yourself in space using this GPS technology. Initially, because it was a military application, they put noise in the signal, so you knew that it wasn't going to be completely accurate. However, for scientific approaches, a way around this was to place base stations on a known location, such as a building at a university. These produce signals that could help clarify where the position was and get rid of the noise in the signal by comparing the GPS signal at that known location with what is arriving from the satellite at the same time that you're doing your measurement. So if the time is the same in your GPS and the base station, this can be used to post hoc determine accurately where the location is. And so this was used for quite a while. Eventually, they removed the noise from the signals, and so the base stations weren't nearly as important, although they were used initially. What took its place, however, were satellites that were put up that would correct for atmospheric variability, which can also impact the accuracy of a GPS signal. So what the GPSs would now have would be a way to sense both the correction from a WAS or something like that, which would take into account atmospheric variation and compare that to the signal being read from the GPS satellite. And this could again give a very accurate estimate of the specific location. It's not always completely accurate, but one way to compensate for that is a GPS like the Trimble is that you can have it over a point and take 10, 20, 30 measurements, and the average of those would be more accurate than any one signal or point in time would be. And so when we've done this in the field, we have a standard where we let it take 10 measurements and then use that to get the same sort of accuracy that's much better than you can get from just one bit of information. And so you can get really, really accurate location information this way. And using this saves a lot of time in the field because you don't have to set up the transit equipment. You don't have to set up points in advance that you have to use to be able to triangulate. You just go to the point you're interested in measuring. Often you have the GPS on a pole, so you can set it exactly where you want it, and you hold it so that it's completely vertical. You take your 10 measurements and get the average, and that gives you a really good estimate of what your current location is. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you use this technique, what we usually use in ecology are UTMs. So this is the north-south UTM, and this is the east-west UTM. And the reason that those are used in ecological studies for defining coordinates is that these are in meters. And so you can look at this, and if you have two different measurements, you can tell how far apart they are by subtracting, and that tells you how many meters apart they are. Now, one mistake a lot of people do in taking these UTM coordinates like this and trying to analyze those in the computer is that you'll note that there are a lot of significant digits in there. I can't count right away, but there may be 10 or 15. And if you know something about computers, the problem is that you end up with rounding error because computers, particularly for real numbers, aren't completely accurate. And so what you generally do is decide that one of your points that you've measured is going to be your anchor point or the 0, 0 point, and you can subtract its coordinates from the coordinates of the other points, and this gets it into a scale that's usable in the computer. So in an 80 meter by 80 meter grid, instead of using a number like 464,653,386 as your location, you can use meter 2 up to meter 80. And those numbers can be used in a computer without worrying about rounding error. So that's one sort of gotcha with this technique of using GPS technology that I ran into until I realized what was going on. It can cause some really screwy results. So that's been a great advance in ecology. We can be much more efficient, and we can do our sampling much more rapidly in terms of getting coordinates associated to positions. Now, a really exciting technology that is now coming on that is being used for this kind of thing makes it even easier if you have the right kind of system. And that is we can now use drones. There's a picture of one in here, and not ones that you buy maybe in MediaMarkt, but ones that you buy that are more scientifically set up. You can attach sensors to it such as LiDAR, which is a really amazing technology that uses laser beams to be able to produce the geometry on the ground of things like shrubs here. And it can also give you GPS coordinates. You can fly the drone over your sample site, and if you can identify shrubs by the images, such as here, you can place them in space with known UTM coordinates, and using the LiDAR, you can actually do things like understand what the shape and size of that is. So if you're doing a marked point pattern and you care about the size of the shrubs within your pattern. You can get that data as well with some post-processing. And so you can have an area, and depending upon how long your drone can fly, you can fly it back and forth over your system. It can take the LiDAR information in, and you can have computer programs set up that can identify where the shrubs are, as in XY coordinate positions, potentially the size of the shrubs. That can be put into the computer, and then you're set to analyze without having to go in the field and measure things directly at all. You use this remote technology. It's gotten even better in that it's self-correcting in terms of the flight path, so that the GPS or the point accuracy and location accuracy of these is really, really good. And so this is the direction things are going. Using a drone, it's not very cheap, so a lot of people still aren't using it, but once the technology has been around for a while, it's probably going to get cheaper and easier for many people to access. And so this sort of ends sort of the development of the technology, where we're going, and hopefully where it is going to get even easier to do very large areas and to get a better idea at a local to a very broad scale using these kinds of techniques. So we'll stop there with the development of the technology for sort of placing points in a map in the field in a way that can be analyzed. And in the next videos, I'll be talking about a project that was done using old school transit technology back in the 1990s, where we've used some of these techniques to analyze spatial pattern in a plant community that's of great interest. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.